The morning fog rolled across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Michael Harrison adjusted his bearskin hat for what felt like the 1,000th time in his career. 23 years of service had taught him that perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. Every button polished to a mirror shine, every crease in his red tunic sharp enough to cut paper, every movement precise and deliberate. This was not just a job. This was a sacred duty passed down through generations of British soldiers who stood as living symbols of tradition, discipline, and unwavering dedication. Michael's father had been a royal guard, his grandfather before him. The Harrison family had protected the crown for nearly a century, and Michael carried that legacy with quiet pride. But today felt different. Today marked exactly 1 week before his retirement. After more than 2 decades of standing motionless in rain, snow, and scorching heat, of ignoring tourists who poked, prodded, and tested his patience, he would finally hang up his uniform. His daughter Emma's wedding was scheduled for next month, and he had promised his late wife that he would walk their little girl down the aisle. That promise kept him going through the hardest days. The morning briefing had been routine. Captain Reynolds reminded the guards about the increased tourist activity due to the summer season. Millions of visitors descended upon London each year, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous stoic guards. Most were respectful, fascinated by the pageantry and history, but some, Reynolds warned, were becoming increasingly brazen in their attempts to get viral content for social media. There had been incidents, guards being shouted at, having objects thrown near them, tourists deliberately trying to make them break composure. The instructions were always the same: maintain discipline, ignore provocation, trust that security would handle any serious threats. Michael took his position at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The familiar weight of his rifle rested against his shoulder, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance, seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. This was the paradox of being a royal guard. You were simultaneously a statue and a highly trained soldier, constantly aware of every movement in your peripheral vision, every potential threat, every change in the crowd's energy. Years of training had honed this ability to a razor's edge. The first few hours passed without incident. School children waved enthusiastically, their teachers explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. Elderly couples took photographs, remembering their own visits decades earlier. Japanese tourists bowed respectfully before snapping pictures. A young boy saluted him with such earnest admiration that Michael felt a warm flutter in his chest, though his face remained completely impassive. These were the moments that reminded him why this duty mattered. He was not just standing guard. He was preserving something timeless, something that connected the present to centuries of British history. Around noon, the crowd began to thicken. Summer holidays meant larger groups, longer queues, more noise. Michael's training kicked in automatically. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, despite the heat building inside his heavy uniform. Sweat trickled down his back, but he did not flinch. AB landed on his nose for a full 30 seconds before flying away. He did not blink. This was what separated amateurs from professionals. Pain, discomfort, distraction, these were tests to be passed, not obstacles to complain about. Then he noticed them. 3 young men in their mid-20s, expensive sneakers, designer sunglasses, phones held up filming everything. They moved through the crowd with an arrogant swagger that immediately set off alarm bells in Michael's trained awareness. One of them, tall with bleached blonde hair and a shirt that screamed "Look at me," seemed to be directing the others. They were speaking loudly in American accents, laughing, pushing past other tourists without apology. Michael had seen this type before. Influencers, content creators, people who believed that millions of online followers gave them permission to behave however they wanted in pursuit of the next viral video. The blonde one, who the others called Rick, pulled out what appeared to be a small bottle from his backpack. He shook it dramatically, making exaggerated faces at the camera. His friends howled with laughter. They moved closer to Michael's position, and he could hear fragments of their conversation over the ambient noise of the crowd. Something about extreme challenge and this is going to break the internet and nobody's done anything this crazy yet. Warning signals flashed in Michael's mind, but protocol was clear. He could not break position, he could not speak, he could not react unless physically attacked. Security personnel patrolled the area, but they were dealing with a particularly large tour group on the opposite side of the courtyard. Rick approached within 10 feet, still filming himself. His friends positioned themselves to capture different angles. Other tourists began to notice something was happening and started recording too, sensing that whatever was about to occur would be worth capturing. The crowd's energy shifted from casual observation to anticipatory excitement. Michael's muscles tensed imperceptibly beneath his uniform. Every sense heightened. He tracked Rick's movements through his peripheral vision, noting the bottle now held prominently in his right hand. The label was bright red with flames on it. Some kind of hot sauce, Michael realized. Extremely hot sauce, judging by the warning labels visible even from this distance. Rick turned to face his friends, speaking directly into his phone camera with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times. "Alright guys, Rick Davison here with another extreme prank that nobody has ever done before. We're here at Buckingham Palace, and I'm about to test if these royal guards are really as tough as everyone says. If this video gets 5 million likes, I'll do something even crazier next week. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button." His friends whooped and cheered, encouraging him with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from too much privilege and too little consequence. Michael's jaw tightened fractionally, a movement so slight that no observer would notice. But internally, he was running through scenarios, calculating responses, preparing for whatever came next. He had faced protesters, aggressive tourists, even someone who once tried to steal his rifle as a dare. He had maintained composure through all of it, but something about this felt different, more dangerous, more deliberately malicious. Rick was not just seeking attention, he was seeking to humiliate, to prove that even the most disciplined soldier could be broken for entertainment. The crowd had grown larger now, forming a semicircle around the scene. Phones were everywhere, dozens of people recording, anticipating the moment that would be shared, liked, commented on, and forgotten within the endless scroll of social media content. Nobody intervened. Nobody questioned whether what was about to happen was right or appropriate. They were all complicit, eager witnesses to whatever spectacle was about to unfold. This was the world Michael was retiring into. A world where boundaries had dissolved, where respect was an outdated concept, where anything could be justified if it generated enough views. Rick unscrewed the cap from the bottle. The liquid inside was almost black, thick like syrup, with visible pepper flakes suspended throughout. Even from several feet away, Michael could smell it, a searing chemical odor that made his eyes water slightly. This was not ordinary hot sauce. This was something designed to cause genuine pain. Something that carried warnings about skin contact and emergency medical attention. And Rick was holding it casually, carelessly, like a weapon he did not fully understand he was wielding. "Here we go," Rick shouted, and everything seemed to slow down. Michael saw his arm draw back, saw the bottle tilt, saw the dark liquid begin to arc through the air in a grotesque ribbon. His training told him not to move, not to react, to trust in protocol and procedure. But his instincts, honed through decades of military service, screamed at him that this was different. This was an attack. And in the fraction of a second before the hot sauce struck his face, Michael Harrison made a decision that would change everything. The liquid hit him directly in the eyes with shocking force. Immediate, excruciating pain exploded across his face like acid. His vision disappeared instantly into blinding white agony. Every nerve ending in his eyes, nose, and mouth screamed in unified torment. The capsaicin, concentrated 2 levels far beyond anything meant for human consumption, began to burn through his tear ducts, searing his corneas, triggering involuntary responses that his body could not control. He felt his knees buckle, heard the crowd gasp collectively, heard Rick laughing triumphantly, still filming, capturing every second of Michael's suffering for the entertainment of millions. And then, something inside Michael Harrison clicked into place. Something primal and furious and absolutely done with being a silent statue for the amusement of people who respected nothing. Through the white-hot agony consuming his face, Michael Harrison remained standing. His military training, drilled into him through countless hours of the most rigorous preparation the British Army could provide, overrode every screaming impulse to collapse, to claw at his burning eyes, to surrender to the pain. His rifle stayed firmly against his shoulder. His posture, though wavering, held. But inside his mind, a war was raging between discipline and survival instinct. The hot sauce was not just burning, it was destroying. He could feel blisters forming on his eyelids, could taste blood where the caustic liquid had run into his mouth, could sense something fundamentally wrong happening to his vision, even beyond the immediate blindness. Rick continued filming, his voice loud and excited as he narrated for his audience. "Oh my God, guys, did you see that? Did you see his face? He's still standing though. These guards are insane. This is already at 200,000 views and we just posted it 30 seconds ago." His friends were doubled over with laughter, high-fitting each other, completely oblivious to the severity of what they had actually done. To them, this was content. This was success. This was what their followers demanded, and they had delivered spectacularly. The crowd's reaction was mixed and chaotic. Some people were laughing, caught up in the spectacle, treating it like street entertainment. Others had stopped recording, faces pale with shock and concern. An elderly British woman pushed through the onlookers, her voice sharp with fury. "What is wrong with you? That's assault. Someone call the police immediately." But her words were drowned out by the noise, by Rick's continued commentary, by the general confusion about what was happening and whether intervention was appropriate or even allowed. The bystander effect was in full force. Everyone assumed someone else would do something, so nobody did anything. Security personnel finally noticed the commotion. 2 guards in plain clothes began moving through the crowd, speaking urgently into their radios. But they were still 30 yards away, blocked by the dense mass of tourists who had swarmed to witness the incident. Michael could hear their voices calling out, ordering people to move aside. But the sound seemed distant and muffled, as if he were underwater. His entire world had narrowed to the screaming pain in his eyes, and the monumental effort required to remain conscious and upright. Through sheer force of will, Michael took one step forward, then another. His movements were deliberate and terrifying in their controlled precision despite his obvious agony. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something had shifted. Rick stopped laughing. His camera continued recording, but his smile faltered as he watched the guard he had just attacked begin to move. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing someone in that much pain refuse to break, refuse to fall, refuse to give the attacker the satisfaction of complete victory. Michael's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse but steady. "You are under citizen's arrest for assault on a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces." The words came from muscle memory, from training scenarios he had practiced but never actually needed to use. His vision was still completely gone, just blazing white pain, but his other senses compensated. He could hear Rick's breathing, could smell his expensive cologne, could track his position through sound and air displacement. 23 years of training had prepared him for situations far more complex than this. Rick's bravado cracked. Whoa, dude. It was just a prank. Just a joke, man. Can't you take a joke? He backed up several steps, finally realizing that he might have miscalculated badly. His friends had stopped laughing entirely. The tourists who had been filming were now capturing something very different from what they had expected. This was not a funny video of a stoic guard being pranked. This was a wounded soldier refusing to surrender his post despite being attacked. The narrative was shifting in real time. Security finally broke through the crowd. 3 officers surrounded Michael immediately, one of them gently taking his rifle while another guided him by the elbow. "Sir, we need to get you medical attention right now. Can you tell us what happened?" Michael's knees finally buckled, and they caught him before he fell. The adrenaline that had kept him standing was wearing off, and his body was beginning to shut down in response to the chemical attack. But before he allowed himself to be led away, he pointed in Rick's direction with frightening accuracy considering his blindness. "Him, that man. He threw industrial-grade capsaicin in my face. It was deliberate assault. Detain him." 2 other security officers immediately moved toward Rick, who was now frantically trying to back away into the crowd. "It was just hot sauce. It's just a prank channel. I have 5 million subscribers. You can't arrest me for a prank." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The officers were professionals who had just watched one of their own be attacked. Whatever sympathy they might have had evaporated the moment they saw Michael's face. His eyes were swollen almost shut, tears and blood streaming down his cheeks. His skin an angry red that was already beginning to blister. This was not a prank. This was a crime. One of Rick's friends tried to intervene. "Hey, you can't just grab him. We're American citizens. We have rights." The security officer fixing him with a cold stare that could have frozen fire. "So did the guard you just attacked. Now step back or you'll be detained as accomplices." The friends exchanged nervous glances and retreated, suddenly very interested in examining their phones and pretending they had not been involved. An ambulance had been called, but in the meantime, medical personnel from the palace's own emergency response team arrived. They guided Michael to a bench and began flushing his eyes with a saline solution. Their movements quick and professional, but gentle. "Sergeant Harrison, I need you to try to keep your eyes open. I know it hurts, but we need to flush out as much of the chemical as possible." Michael complied, though every instinct screamed to keep his eyes squeezed shut. The pain was somehow getting worse, not better. As the initial shock wore off and his nerve endings fully registered the damage, the crowd had grown even larger now, but the mood had completely changed. People were quiet, somber, many looking ashamed that they had been entertained by what was clearly a serious assault. The elderly woman who had called for help earlier pushed through to Michael's side. "You're incredibly brave, young man. What that horrible person did was inexcusable. I've gotten everything on video if the police need it." She pressed a business card into the medic's hand. "I'm a retired barrister. If he needs representation, tell him to call me. No charge." Rick was being detained against a palace wall. His phone confiscated, his protests ignored. Police had arrived and were taking statements from witnesses. One officer was reviewing the video footage that dozens of people had captured. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Rick Davison, in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras, had committed assault on a serving member of the British Armed Forces on Crown property. The legal implications were staggering, and his lawyer would later confirm that he could not have picked a worse target or location if he had deliberately tried to maximize his criminal liability. The paramedics loaded Michael into the ambulance. As they did, Captain Reynolds appeared, his face ashen with fury and concern. "Harrison, I'm coming with you to the hospital. Your daughter has been notified. She's meeting us there." Michael nodded weakly, unable to speak through the pain. Reynolds turned to face the assembled guards who had abandoned their posts in the chaos. "Return to positions. Maintain the watch. Harrison would want the duty fulfilled." The guards saluted crisply and returned to their stations, though every one of them was shaken by what they had witnessed. In the ambulance, as the siren wailed through London traffic, Michael finally allowed himself to fully feel the extent of his injury. His eyes were not improving. The burning had settled into a deep, throbbing agony that suggested serious damage. The paramedic monitoring him had a concerned expression that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. "Sir, The concentration of capsaicin in that substance was extremely high, higher than anything I've seen in 20 years of emergency medicine. Your corneas have sustained significant chemical burns. We're taking you directly to Moorfields Eye Hospital. They're the best in the country for this type of injury. Michael processed this information with the calm acceptance of a soldier who had always known that duty came with risks. He had just never imagined those risks would come from a tourist with a bottle of hot sauce and a smartphone. The irony was not lost on him. He had survived tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, had stood guard during terrorist threats and suspicious package investigations, had been trained to handle armed assailants and coordinated attacks, and he had been taken down by a spoiled content creator seeking viral fame. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The paramedic retrieved it and held it where Michael could hear. "It's your daughter, sir. Do you want to speak to her?" Michael nodded, and the phone was placed near his ear. Emma's voice came through, frightened and crying. Dad, they said you were attacked. Are you okay? I'm driving to the hospital right now. Please tell me you're okay." Michael tried to make his voice steady and reassuring despite everything. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a minor incident. Don't speed on my account. I'll be waiting for you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the lie fathers tell daughters to protect them from harsh realities for just a little while longer. Emma made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're such a terrible liar. Dad, I'll be there in 10 minutes. I love you." The ambulance pulled into the hospital emergency bay. Medical staff were waiting. Having been briefed on the situation, they moved with urgent efficiency, transferring Michael to a gurney and wheeling him directly to an examination room. A specialist was already scrubbing in, ready to assess the damage. As they cut away his uniform tunic to attach monitoring equipment, Michael felt a profound sense of loss. That uniform had been his identity for more than 2 decades. Now it was just bloodied fabric being discarded in a medical waste bin. The specialist, Dr. Sarah Chen, leaned over him with a pen. "Sergeant Harrison, I'm going to examine your eyes now. It's going to be uncomfortable, but I need you to stay as still as possible." She carefully pried open his eyelids, which had swollen significantly. Michael heard her sharp intake of breath. "Nurse, I need a pH test immediately, and prepare for emergency irrigation. We're looking at severe chemical keratitis, possible permanent corneal scarring." Her words were professional and clinical, but Michael heard the underlying concern. This was bad. Worse than he had allowed himself to believe. That as the medical team worked on him, as his daughter burst through the doors and grabbed his hand, as police officers arrived to take his official statement, Michael Harrison felt something inside him harden into cold determination. He would survive this, he would recover, and he would make absolutely certain that Rick Davison understood that actions had consequences, that soldiers were not props for entertainment, and that sometimes the price of viral fame was far higher than anyone could have imagined. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Michael had been in surgery for 3 hours while Dr. Chen and her team worked to minimize the damage to his corneas. Emma sat in the waiting room the entire time, her phone clutched in her hand, updating family members and friends with each sparse piece of information the nurses provided. Captain Reynolds had stayed as well, pacing the corridor like a caged lion, making phone calls to military brass and legal representatives. This was not just a medical emergency. This was an international incident involving the assault of a royal guard on palace grounds, captured on video and already spreading across the internet like wildfire. When Michael finally woke from anesthesia, the first thing he noticed was that his eyes were bandaged completely. Thick gauze wrapped around his head, blocking out all light. The second thing he noticed was Emma's hand gripping her thumb moving in small circles on his palm, the way she had done since she was a little girl seeking comfort. "Dad, can you hear me?" Her voice was thick with tears, but trying desperately to sound strong. Michael squeezed her hand gently. "I'm here, sweetheart." Still kicking, his throat was raw from the breathing tube, his words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Dr. Chen entered the room, her footsteps soft but purposeful. Michael had learned to identify people by their movements, a skill that was going to become significantly more important if his vision did not return. "Sergeant Harrison, the surgery went as well as could be expected under the circumstances. We've removed the damaged tissue from your corneas and applied a specialized membrane to promote healing. However, I need to be completely honest with you about your prognosis." She paused, choosing her words carefully. The concentration of capsaicin in that hot sauce was over 2 million Scoville units. For context, police-grade pepper spray is typically around 2 million. What was thrown at you was essentially a chemical weapon disguised as food product. Emma's grip on Michael's hand tightened painfully. Dr. Chen continued, her voice professional but compassionate. "You have severe chemical burns on both corneas. The good news is that we caught it early, and the irrigation helped prevent some of the deeper damage. The bad news is that you will have permanent scarring. Your right eye has a 60% chance of recovering functional vision with treatment and time. Your left eye is more severely damaged. We're looking at possibly 20 to 30% vision recovery, and that's optimistic. You will never return to full visual acuity. I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Michael had known, somewhere deep down, that the damage was serious. But hearing it confirmed, hearing the percentages and the permanence, made it real in a way that shattered something inside him. His career was over. Not in a week as he had planned, with ceremony and honor and a proper goodbye. But right now, in a hospital bed, because some stranger decided that his suffering would make good content, Emma was openly crying now, her face pressed against his shoulder. "It's not fair, Dad. It's not fair. You were just doing your job." Captain Reynolds stepped into the room, his presence commanding even in this sterile medical environment. "Harrison, I need you to know that this is being treated with the utmost seriousness at every level. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has personally taken charge of the investigation. The Ministry of Defense is involved. Even the Prime Minister's office has been briefed. What happened to you is not being swept aside or minimized. This man will face the full consequences of his actions." There was steel in his voice, the kind of cold fury that comes from watching one of your soldiers be attacked and being powerless to prevent it. Michael nodded slowly, processing this information. "What about the man who did this?" "Rick Davison." Reynolds' expression darkened. "He's in custody, charged with grievous bodily harm, assault on a public official, and several other offenses. His bail hearing is tomorrow, but the Crown Prosecution Service is arguing for remand, given the severity of the attack and his status as a foreign national with no ties to the UK. His lawyer is already making noise about it being an accident, a prank gone wrong, youthful indiscretion, the usual defenses." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "But we have something they don't expect. Evidence that this was not his first offense." This caught Michael's attention, Reynolds continued. "After his arrest, social media investigators went through his entire online history. Rick Davison runs a channel called Extreme Rick with over 5 million subscribers. His content is built entirely around dangerous pranks and pushing boundaries. In the past 6 months alone, he's been involved in at least 12 incidents where people were injured or traumatized. He pepper-sprayed a homeless veteran in Los Angeles as a social experiment. He pushed a waiter into a swimming pool, causing a shoulder injury. He convinced his followers to call in fake bomb threats to schools for views. This is not some kid who made a mistake. This is a pattern of deliberate harm for profit." Emma's tears had turned to anger. How is someone like that allowed to have a platform? How do 5 million people watch someone hurt others and think it's entertainment? It was a question that had no good answer. A symptom of a social media culture that rewarded outrage and shock value above all else. Dr. Chen interjected quietly. "Unfortunately, Sergeant Harrison is not even his most seriously injured victim. 3 months ago, one of his pranks caused a car accident in Miami. A young mother suffered permanent spinal damage. She's in a wheelchair for life. But somehow he kept making videos, kept gaining followers, kept finding new victims." Michael felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He had been prepared to forgive, to move on, to chalk this up to stupidity and poor judgment. But this was different. This was a predator who deliberately caused harm and faced no consequences because he hid behind the label of entertainment. "I want to testify," he said quietly. "When this goes to trial, I want to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what he's taken from me." Dr. Chun touched his shoulder gently. "Sergeant, you're still bandaged. You won't be able to see him." Michael's voice was flat and cold. "I don't need to see him. I just need him to hear me." Over the next 2 days, Michael's hospital room became a hub of activity. Police detectives came to take detailed statements. A military lawyer arrived to explain his rights and options for civil litigation. Media relations officers from the Ministry of Defense briefed him on the absolute firestorm that had erupted in the press. The video of the attack had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. Public opinion had turned savagely against Rick Davison. His social media accounts had been suspended or deleted. Sponsors had pulled their support. Major news outlets were running exposés on the dark side of prank culture and the real harm caused by content creators who valued views over human dignity. But the most surprising visitor came on the 3rd day. Michael heard the door open and an unfamiliar voice speak. "Sergeant Harrison, my name is Amanda Cole. I was one of Rick Davison's victims 3 years ago." Emma, who had barely left her father's side, straightened in her chair. "What did he do to you?" Amanda's voice trembled slightly. "I was working as a waitress in Las Vegas. He came into the restaurant with his friends and ordered food. When I brought their meals, he pretended to find a hair in his soup and threw the entire bowl at me. It was nearly boiling. I had second-degree burns on my arms and chest. When I tried to press charges, his lawyer made my life hell. They claimed I was seeking attention, that I was trying to exploit his fame for money. Eventually, I dropped the case because I couldn't afford to fight anymore." Michael felt his jaw clench. "Why are you here now?" Amanda moved closer, and he heard her pull up a chair. "Because when I saw what he did to you, something inside me broke. I realized I had let him get away with it. I had let him continue hurting people because I was too afraid to keep fighting. But you didn't back down. Even blind and in pain, you stood your ground and made sure he was arrested. You did what I should have done. So I'm here to offer my testimony. If the prosecutors will have me, I want to tell my story. I want the court to know that this wasn't an isolated incident. This is who he is." Over the next week, more victims came forward. The waiter he had pushed into the pool, A teenager he had humiliated at a shopping mall, a taxi driver he had refused to pay after deliberately making him drive in circles for content, an elderly man he had scared with an air horn as a jump scare challenge. Each story painted a picture of someone who viewed other human beings as props for his entertainment empire, who calculated that the revenue from viral videos outweighed any potential legal consequences. The prosecutors building the case against him suddenly had a mountain of evidence, demonstrating a pattern of behavior that went far beyond a single prank gone wrong. Michael's bandages were changed daily, and each time Dr. Chen examined his eyes with increasing concern. The scarring was extensive. His right eye showed some improvement, blurry shapes and light sensitivity that suggested healing was occurring, but his left eye remained completely dark, unresponsive to light or movement. The optic nerve may have sustained damage we didn't initially detect, Dr. Chen explained. We're consulting with specialists, but I want you to prepare for the possibility that your left eye may never recover meaningful vision. Emma had taken a leave of absence from her job to stay with her father. Her fiancé David visited daily, bringing fresh clothes and home-cooked meals and quiet support. The wedding planning had stopped completely. Emma refused to even discuss it while her father was in the hospital. We can get married any time, she told him firmly. Right now, you're what matters. Everything else can wait. But Michael knew she was sacrificing her own happiness, putting her life on hold because of what someone else had done to him. It was another theft, another thing Rick Davison had taken without permission or remorse. The bail hearing had resulted in Rick being remanded in custody. The judge had been unimpressed by his lawyer's arguments about his clean record, noting dryly that having no prior convictions was not the same as having no prior offenses, especially when dozens of victims were now coming forward. Rick would remain in jail until trial, which was fast-tracked given the high-profile nature of the case and the overwhelming public interest. His social media empire was crumbling. His former friends and collaborators were desperately trying to distance themselves from him. Sponsors were issuing public apologies for ever associating with his brand. The internet had turned on him completely, and for once, the court of public opinion and the actual court were aligned in seeking justice. Michael spent his days learning to navigate the world without sight. Occupational therapists taught him techniques for mobility and daily living. He learned to count steps, to use sound and touch to orient himself, to accept help without feeling diminished. It was humbling and frustrating and exhausting. Simple tasks that he had performed without thought for decades now required intense concentration. Getting dressed, eating a meal, walking to the bathroom. Everything was a challenge, a reminder of what had been stolen from him on what should have been an ordinary morning at his post. But through it all, he held on to one certainty. Rick Davison would face justice. Not just legal justice, but the kind that came from looking at the real human cost of actions and being forced to acknowledge that numbers on a screen represented actual people with actual lives that had been damaged or destroyed. Michael would make sure of it. When his day in court came, he would stand before the judge and the jury and Rick Davison himself, and he would speak the truth with the same unwavering dedication that had defined his entire career. Some duties transcended the uniform. Some battles had to be fought even when you could no longer see the enemy clearly. This was one of them. 6 weeks after the attack, Michael Harrison was discharged from the hospital with a white cane, a bag full of medications, and a future that looked nothing like what he had planned. His right eye had recovered enough function that he could see shapes and movement, though everything was blurred and distorted as if he were looking through frosted glass. His left eye remained completely dark, the optic nerve too damaged to transmit any signal to his brain. Dr. Chen had done everything possible, consulted with specialists across Europe, tried experimental treatments and therapies, but some damage was simply irreversible. Michael was legally blind, would never drive again, would never read a book without assistive technology, would never see his daughter's face clearly on her wedding day. Emma had postponed the wedding, indefinitely despite Michael's protests. "I'm not walking down the aisle while you're still recovering," she had said with the same iron determination that Michael recognized from his own personality. "We'll get married when you're ready to actually enjoy it, not when you're still learning to pour coffee without spilling it." It was said, with love but also with a hint of the frustration. They both felt at how completely their lives had been disrupted by a stranger's 15 seconds of poor judgment. Media attention had not faded. If anything, it had intensified as the trial date approached. Michael's story had resonated globally, sparking conversations about the toxic culture of viral content creation, the responsibility of social media platforms, and the real human cost of treating people as entertainment. Documentaries were being produced. Think pieces filled newspapers and websites. Legislators in multiple countries were proposing laws specifically targeting dangerous prank content. Rick Davison had inadvertently sparked a cultural reckoning. Though he would receive no credit for the positive changes that might eventually emerge from the damage he had caused, Michael had been contacted by representatives from the Royal British Legion, veterans advocacy groups, and even international organizations supporting assault victims. Everyone wanted him to speak, to share his story, to become a symbol of resilience in the face of senseless violence. But Michael was not interested in being a symbol. He was interested in justice. The Crown Prosecution Service had assigned their most experienced prosecutor to the case, a sharp woman named Margaret Thorne, who had built her reputation on securing convictions in high-profile assault cases. She had met with Michael multiple times, preparing him for testimony, explaining the legal strategy, managing his expectations about what justice might actually look like in practical terms. The challenge, Margaret had explained during one of their meetings, is that Davison's defense team is going to paint him as a foolish young man who made a terrible mistake but didn't intend serious harm. They'll argue that he bought what he thought was just very spicy hot sauce, that he didn't know it was dangerous, that it was meant to be a silly prank that went wrong. They'll present character witnesses talking about his charity work and his community involvement. They'll show videos of him being friendly and personable. They'll try to make the jury sympathize with him. Michael had listened to this with growing anger. He has a pattern of hurting people. You have other victims willing to testify. How can they possibly argue this was an innocent mistake? Margaret's smile had been grim. They can argue anything. Whether the jury believes it is another matter. That's where you come in. Your testimony, delivered by a decorated soldier with 23 years of honorable service, will be powerful. But you need to be prepared for his lawyer to attack your credibility, to suggest you're exaggerating your injuries, to imply that you're seeking attention or financial compensation. They'll try to make you angry, to make you seem vindictive rather than victimized. The trial began on a cold October morning. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and protesters, split between those supporting Michael and demanding justice and a smaller group of Rick's fans, who somehow still believed he was being persecuted for creating content. Michael arrived with Emma and Captain Reynolds, navigating the steps with his cane while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every available seat filled with journalists, legal observers, victims' advocates, and military personnel in dress uniform who had come to show solidarity with one of their own. Rick Davison sat at the defense table looking very different from the confident, laughing figure in his videos. He had lost weight during his time in custody. His expensive clothes had been replaced with an ill-fitting suit. His bleached hair had grown out to show dark roots. He looked young and scared, and very much aware that he was facing the possibility of years in prison. His parents sat in the gallery behind him, their faces showing the particular anguish of people watching their child face consequences they never imagined possible. His lawyer, a polished man named Gerald Chambers, sat beside him, making notes and occasionally leaning over to whisper reassurances that looked increasingly hollow. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Margaret Thorne walked the jury through every element of the crime with clinical precision. She presented the video evidence, which showed Rick clearly and deliberately throwing the hot sauce directly at Michael's face. She brought in a chemist who explained exactly how dangerous the substance was, comparing it to riot control agents used by law enforcement. She presented medical experts who detailed the extent of Michael's injuries, the surgeries required, the permanent damage sustained. She established that this was not a prank. This was an assault with a chemical weapon. Then came the parade of previous victims. Amanda Cole testified about the burns she received from hot soup. The taxi driver described being cheated and humiliated. The homeless veteran spoke about being pepper sprayed while sleeping and the panic attack that followed, triggering PTSD from his military service. The teenager talked about being mocked and followed through a mall while Rick's followers harassed her online for weeks afterward. Each testimony built a picture of someone who caused harm deliberately and repeatedly, who knew the consequences of his actions and simply did not care. Because the views and revenue outweighed any moral considerations, Rick's defense tried to counter with character witnesses. Former teachers talked about him being a good student. His parents testified that he had never been violent at home. A youth pastor described his volunteer work at community events, but it felt hollow against the weight of evidence showing years of documented harm. Chambers argued that Rick's content was satire, social commentary, a modern form of entertainment that some people simply did not understand. He suggested that the victims were oversensitive, seeking attention, or trying to profit from their association with a famous content creator. It was a strategy that might have worked in a different era, but in a courtroom filled with people who had seen the actual consequences of Rick's actions, it fell flat. When Michael was finally called to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. Emma helped him to the witness stand, and he carefully sat down, his white cane resting against the chair. The judge spoke gently. "Sergeant Harrison, thank you for your service and for being here today. Please state your name for the record." Michael's voice was steady and clear, the same tone he had used for 2 decades when giving reports to superior officers. "Sergeant Michael James Harrison, Royal Guard, service number 24,681,357, retired." Margaret Thorne approached the stand. "Sergeant Harrison, can you tell the court in your own words what happened on the morning of August 15th? Michael took a breath and began. He described his routine, his position at the palace, the approaching group of young men. He described seeing Rick prepare to throw the hot sauce, the moment of impact, the immediate and excruciating pain. He described trying to maintain his post despite being blinded, the the decision to arrest Rick rather than simply collapse. His testimony was factual and unemotional, but somehow that made it more powerful. This was not someone seeking sympathy. This was a professional giving a report about an attack he had survived. Margaret asked about the aftermath. Michael described the surgeries, the weeks of blindness, the slow and partial recovery of vision in one eye. He talked about learning to navigate the world differently, about the independence he had lost, about the career that ended not with honor but with violence. I had planned to retire 1 week after the attack, he said quietly. I was going to walk my daughter down the aisle at her wedding the following month. I had saved money for that day, planned every detail with my late wife before she passed. That future is gone now. Emma postponed the wedding indefinitely because I cannot see well enough to walk her down the aisle without help. I cannot see her face clearly. I will never see my grandchildren clearly if I am blessed enough to have them. That was taken from me by a man who thought my pain would be entertaining for his followers. The courtroom was absolutely still. Several jurors were crying. Even the judge looked shaken. Margaret asked her final question. Sergeant Harrison, what do you want this court to understand about what happened to you? Michael turned his head toward where he knew Rick was sitting, though he could not see him clearly. I want the court to understand that I am not a prop. I am not a character in someone's content. I am a human being who dedicated my adult life to service and duty. I stood guard to protect history and tradition and something bigger than myself. And I was attacked for entertainment. That should horrify everyone in this room. Because if it can happen to me, in front of Buckingham Palace, in broad daylight, with hundreds of witnesses, then it can happen to anyone. We have created a culture where hurting people for views is acceptable, where real pain is content, where someone like Mr. Davison can build an empire on the suffering of others. That needs to end. The cross-examination was brutal but ultimately ineffective. Chambers tried to suggest that Michael's injuries were not as severe as claimed, that he was exaggerating for sympathy. He pointed out that Michael could see well enough to navigate the courtroom. Michael's response was calm and devastating. I can see shapes and movement in my right eye. I cannot read. I cannot drive. I cannot recognize faces unless they are within a foot of me. I am legally blind. If you would like, I can provide testimony from 3 independent ophthalmologists confirming this. Would you like their contact information? Chambers backed down, realizing he was making his client look worse with every question. The defense tried to argue that Rick had not known the hot sauce was dangerous, that he purchased it believing it was just a very spicy food product. The prosecution countered with evidence that Rick had specifically searched for most dangerous hot sauce, an extreme capsaicin challenge online before purchasing the product. They showed that the bottle had multiple warning labels about skin contact and the need for protective equipment when handling. They demonstrated that Rick had commented on those very warnings and messages to his friends, joking about how insane it would be to throw it at someone. The intent was clear. The knowledge was documented. There was no plausible deniability. As the trial progressed, public opinion solidified firmly against Rick. His remaining supporters melted away as the full scope of his pattern of abuse became clear. Social media platforms that had enabled his content for years now scrambled to implement new policies against dangerous prank videos. Advertisers created guidelines refusing to support content that caused harm to others. The cultural shift that had been brewing for years finally crested. And Rick Davison found himself on the wrong side of history. He was no longer an entertainer or a content creator. He was a cautionary tale about what happens when the pursuit of fame completely overrides basic human decency. The prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony. The defense's case lasted less than 3 days, undermined at every turn by the overwhelming evidence and the credibility gap between decorated soldiers and a man whose entire career was built on hurting others. When both sides delivered their closing arguments, the outcome felt inevitable. Margaret Thorne reminded the jury that justice was about more than punishment. It was about society drawing a line and saying that certain behaviors were unacceptable regardless of how many followers you had, or how much money your content generated. Chambers made a last desperate plea for mercy, arguing that Rick was young and could be reformed. But even he seemed to know it was hopeless. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces showed no ambiguity about what they had decided. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who had taken meticulous notes throughout the trial, stood when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The courtroom held its collective breath. Michael sat in the gallery with Emma's hand clasped in his face calm but his heart pounding. This moment would not restore his vision or erase the trauma, but it would determine whether society believed that what happened to him mattered. On the count of grievous bodily harm with intent, how do you find the defendant? The foreman's voice was clear and steady. Guilty. Rick's mother let out a choked sob. His father sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead. Rick himself seemed to collapse inward, his shoulders hunching as the word landed like a physical blow. The foreman continued through each charge. Assault on a public official. Guilty. Reckless endangerment. Guilty. Each verdict was read with the same unwavering certainty. A jury that had seen overwhelming evidence and felt no doubt about their decision. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Justice Patricia Blackwell, dismissed the jury with thanks for their service and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. She looked directly at Rick, her expression showing no sympathy. "Mr. Davison, you have been found guilty of extremely serious crimes. I am ordering a pre-sentencing report and psychological evaluation. You will remain in custody until sentencing. Given the severity of these convictions and the pattern of behavior established during this trial, you should prepare yourself for a substantial custodial sentence." Rick's lawyer began to object, but Justice Blackwell cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Save your arguments for sentencing, Mr. Chambers. This court is adjourned." The media erupted as everyone filed out of the courtroom. Michael was immediately surrounded by reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward his face. Captain Reynolds and 2 other guards formed a protective barrier, guiding him through the crowd. Emma stayed close, her arm linked through his, her voice cutting through the chaos. "My father will not be making a statement at this time. Please respect our privacy." But privacy was impossible. This case had become something bigger than one man's assault. It had become a referendum on internet culture, on accountability, on whether the pursuit of viral fame could finally face real consequences. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to show support for Michael. Veterans in uniforms saluted as he passed. Ordinary citizens held signs reading "Justice for Sergeant Harrison" and "Real people, not content." A group of teachers had brought their students, using this as a teachable moment about digital citizenship and the harm caused by online behavior. Michael was moved by the outpouring, but also exhausted by it. He wanted to go home, to sit in quiet darkness, to process what had just happened without cameras and crowds and constant questions. The 2 weeks before sentencing passed in a strange blur. Michael tried to establish some kind of routine in his new reality. He worked with occupational therapists to improve his mobility and independence. He learned to use screen reading software so he could access news and email. He began attending a support group for people with vision loss, finding unexpected comfort in sharing experiences with others who understood the daily challenges and frustrations. Emma gradually began wedding planning again, approaching it cautiously, as if afraid the rug would be pulled out from under her once more. David was patient and supportive, and Michael found himself genuinely liking his future son-in-law more with each interaction. The prosecution sent Michael a copy of the pre-sentencing report. It made for disturbing reading. The psychological evaluation had diagnosed Rick with narcissistic personality disorder and an empathy deficit that bordered on sociopathy. The evaluator noted that Rick showed no genuine remorse for his victims, only regret about the consequences he now faced. When asked about Michael specifically, Rick had said, "I didn't think it would be that big of a deal. Guards stand there getting harassed all the time. How was I supposed to know he'd react like that?" The stunning lack of accountability, the inability to recognize that he was the problem, not Michael's reaction to being chemically attacked, spoke to a fundamental disconnect from reality. The report also detailed Rick's finances. His content empire had generated over $3 million in revenue over the past 2 years. Sponsorships, ad revenue, merchandise sales, appearance fees. Rick had monetized his cruelty into a substantial income stream. All of those revenue sources had dried up after his arrest, but he still had assets. The prosecution was preparing to argue for substantial financial penalties in addition to prison time, seeking compensation for all the victims who had suffered because of his actions. Amanda Cole was pursuing a civil lawsuit. The paralyzed woman from Miami had filed criminal charges in the United States and was seeking extradition once the UK sentence was complete. Rick's legal problems were just beginning. The sentencing hearing was even more packed than the trial had been. Justice Blackwell allowed several victims to give impact statements before she passed sentence. Amanda described the burns that still scarred her arms, the nightmares that plagued her, the way she flinched whenever someone approached with food or drink. The taxi driver talked about the financial stress of being cheated out of his fare, about feeling stupid and humiliated. The homeless veteran spoke about losing the trust he had slowly rebuilt after years on the streets, about the paranoia that now made him unable to sleep in public places. Each statement added another layer to the portrait of devastation Rick had caused in his pursuit of views and validation. Michael's impact statement was the last one given. He stood at the podium with Emma's help, facing toward where he knew the judge sat. "Your Honor, I have spent most of my adult life in service to something greater than myself. I believed that duty, honor, and integrity mattered. I believed that if you did the right thing, if you served with dedication and professionalism, you would be respected for it. Mr. Davison taught me that I was naive. He showed me that in the world he represents, none of those things matter. Only views matter. Only engagement matters. Only the next viral video matters." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I am 51 years old. I had planned to retire, to spend time with my daughter, to maybe travel with my grandchildren someday. Instead, I am learning to navigate the world as a legally blind man. I cannot see my daughter's smile. I cannot read her wedding invitations without assistance. I will never see my grandchildren's faces clearly. These are not abstract losses. These are real, permanent, devastating consequences of Mr. Davison's actions. And he did this to me while I was serving my country, standing at my post, doing the job I had done with honor for more than 2 decades. Michael's voice hardened. But I am not here asking for revenge. I am here asking for accountability. I am asking that this court send a message that people are not content, that causing harm for entertainment will not be tolerated, that there are consequences when you treat human beings as props in your personal narrative. Mr. Davison had every opportunity to stop. Every time someone was hurt, every time someone complained, every time a victim came forward, he could have changed course. Instead, he escalated. He sought out more extreme content, more dangerous pranks, more vulnerable victims. He did this because he believed he was untouchable. I am asking you to prove him wrong. The courtroom was silent when Michael finished. Justice Blackwell thanked him for his statement and asked Rick if he wanted to address the court before sentencing. Rick stood, his lawyer's hand on his shoulder, looking pale and diminished. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was just trying to make people laugh. I'm sorry. It was the most inadequate apology imaginable, delivered without conviction or genuine understanding of the harm caused. Justice Blackwell's expression showed exactly what she thought of it. She delivered her sentencing remarks with the precision and gravity the moment demanded. Mr. Davison, you have been convicted of grievous bodily harm against a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. The evidence presented at trial showed a clear pattern of behavior, in which you deliberately caused harm to vulnerable individuals for your own profit and fame. You showed no regard for the consequences of your actions. You treated human beings as objects to be used and discarded in pursuit of online engagement. This behavior is not only criminal, it is morally reprehensible. Justice Blackwell continued, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a blade. Sergeant Harrison represented everything that is admirable about service and duty. You represented everything that is toxic about modern internet culture. The contrast could not be more stark. You had millions of followers, substantial income, a platform that many would envy. You could have used that influence for good. Instead, you weaponized it. You created a business model based on the suffering of others. And when you finally faced consequences, you showed no genuine remorse, only self-pity. She looked directly at Rick, ensuring he understood the weight of what was about to be said. The pre-sentencing report makes clear that you pose a continuing danger to the public. You lack empathy, you lack remorse, and you lack any apparent understanding that your actions were wrong rather than simply unfortunate in their consequences. This court has a duty to protect society from individuals who repeatedly harm others without conscience. Therefore, on the charge of grievous bodily harm with intent, I sentence you to 8 years imprisonment. The courtroom erupted. Rick's mother collapsed, sobbing. His father sat rigid with shock. Emma squeezed Michael's hand so hard it hurt. Justice Blackwell was not finished. On the charge of assault on a public official, I sentence you to 3 years imprisonment, to be served concurrently. Additionally, I am imposing a criminal behavior order that will ban you from operating any social media accounts or creating any online content for a period of 10 years following your release. You will also pay compensation to your victims in amounts to be determined in subsequent civil proceedings. Take him down. 2 guards stepped forward to escort Rick from the courtroom. He looked back at his parents one last time, his face finally showing something like real fear as the reality of 8 years in prison settled over him. His lawyer was already talking about appeals, about legal challenges, but everyone in the courtroom knew that Justice Blackwell's sentence was solid. The evidence had been overwhelming. The verdict was sound. The sentence was appropriate. There would be no easy way out of this. Outside the courthouse, Michael gave his first and only press conference. With Emma beside him and Captain Reynolds standing at attention behind him, he read a prepared statement. Today, justice was served, not just for me, but for every person who has been victimized by someone seeking fame at any cost. Rick Davison will spend years in prison, as he should. But my hope is that this case represents something more than one man's punishment. I hope it represents a turning point in how we think about online content, about what we consider entertainment, about the real human beings behind the videos we watch and share. He paused, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I will never fully recover from what was done to me, but I can recover my sense of purpose. I will be working with veterans organizations and victims, advocacy groups to push for stronger laws protecting people from dangerous pranks and harmful content. I will be speaking to schools and community groups about digital citizenship and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. If my suffering can prevent even one person from experiencing something similar, then perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. The questions from reporters came rapid, but Michael answered only a few before Emma gently guided him away. They had said what needed to be said. The rest would unfold in its own time. As they walked to the waiting car, Michael heard someone in the crowd call out, "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Harrison." All of it. He nodded in acknowledgement, a gesture that encompassed not just his military service, but his service to something larger. His willingness to stand up and demand accountability, even when it would have been easier to fade into the background and nurse his wounds privately. That evening, Emma sat with her father in his quiet living room. The news was playing coverage of the sentencing, but Michael had asked her to mute it. He did not need to hear pundits analyzing what had happened. He had lived it. "Dad," Emma said softly, "I know this doesn't fix anything. I know you're still hurt, still angry, still grieving what you lost. But I'm proud of you. Mom would be proud of you too." Michael felt tears prick his damaged eyes. "I just did what anyone should do. I stood up and told the truth." Emma shook her head. "No, most people would have taken a settlement, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and disappeared. You fought because you knew other people needed you to fight. That's what makes you a hero. Not the uniform, not the medals. The choice to keep fighting even when you were wounded." 3 months after Rick Davison began serving his prison sentence, Michael Harrison stood in front of a room full of teenagers at a London secondary school. The assembly hall was packed with students who had been required to attend this presentation about digital citizenship and online responsibility. Most of them had entered the hall with the resigned boredom typical of mandatory assemblies, scrolling through their phones, whispering to friends, expecting another lecture from an adult who did not understand their world. But when Michael walked onto the stage with his white cane, when the lights caught the scars visible around his eyes, when he began to speak about what had happened to him, the room fell completely silent. "My name is Michael Harrison," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "6 months ago, I was attacked while doing my job as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. The person who attacked me was trying to create viral content for his social media followers. He threw industrial-grade hot sauce in my face, causing permanent damage to my eyes. I am now legally blind. I can barely see shapes and movement. I will never see clearly again. And the reason I am here today is to tell you that the person who did this to me was not much older than you are now. He was 24 years old, and he destroyed my life because he thought it would be entertaining." Michael could hear the shift in the room's energy, the uncomfortable rustle of students realizing this was not going to be a typical assembly. He continued, "I am not here to lecture you about staying off social media or to tell you that all content creation is bad. I am here to ask you to think about something very simple. The people in the videos you watch, the people in the pranks you laugh at, the people who become memes and jokes, they are real. They have families, they have jobs. They have dreams and fears and lives that matter just as much as yours. When you watch content where someone is being hurt or humiliated or scared, you are not just watching entertainment. You are watching someone's real pain. And when you like that content, when you share it, when you make it go viral, you are telling creators that causing pain is acceptable as long as it gets views." He paused, letting that sink in. Rick Davison had 5 million followers. 5 million people who watched him hurt others and rewarded him with views and likes and comments. Those 5 million people did not throw hot sauce in my face, but they created the environment that made it profitable for him to do so. They taught him that causing harm was the path to success. So I am asking each of you to think about what kind of online environment you want to create. Do you want to be part of the problem or part of the solution? After the presentation, several students approached Michael with questions. One girl, probably 16, asked quietly, "Do you hate the person who did this to you?" Michael considered the question carefully. "I hate what he did. I hate that he chose views over human decency. But I don't spend my energy hating him as a person. That would give him power over my life that I refuse to grant. Instead, I focus on making sure what happened to me leads to positive change. That is how I take back control." The girl nodded slowly, clearly processing this. "My brother makes prank videos. Nothing as bad as what happened to you, but sometimes people get upset. I'm going to talk to him about this." Michael smiled slightly. That conversation might be the most important thing that comes out of today. "Thank you." The speaking engagements had become a regular part of Michael's new life. Schools, community centers, veterans organizations, even corporate events focused on social media responsibility. Each audience was different, but the message remained the same. People were not content. Actions had consequences. Dignity mattered. The response had been overwhelming. Teachers reported students having serious conversations about their online behavior. Parents talked about having difficult but necessary discussions with their children about what they watched and shared. Several social media platforms invited Michael to consult on their content policies. Though he remained skeptical about whether their interest in reform was genuine or simply good public relations, Emma's wedding was rescheduled for the spring. As the date approached, Michael found himself both excited and anxious. He had been working with a mobility specialist to practice walking down the aisle of the church, counting steps, learning the exact path, preparing so that he could navigate it confidently despite his limited vision. Emma had been patient and understanding, offering to modify anything to make it easier. But Michael was determined to do this properly. He had promised his wife he would walk their daughter down the aisle, and he would keep that promise even if he could barely see where he was going. The legal fallout from Rick's case continued to ripple outward. Amanda Cole's civil lawsuit had resulted in a substantial settlement paid from Rick's seized assets. The paralyzed woman in Miami had successfully argued for his extradition once he completed his UK sentence, meaning Rick would face additional charges in the United States. His former friends and collaborators were facing their own legal troubles, with several being charged as accessories or facing civil suits from victims. The entire ecosystem that had enabled and profited from Rick's content was being dismantled piece by piece. More significantly, legislation was moving forward in Parliament addressing dangerous online content. The Harrison Act, as it was being called in the media, would create specific criminal penalties for content creators who caused harm to others in the pursuit of viral content. It would require platforms to actively moderate and remove dangerous prank content. It would create a victim compensation fund drawn from fines levied against repeat offenders and the platforms that hosted them. Michael had testified before a parliamentary committee, his story helping to illustrate why such legislation was necessary. The bill was expected to pass with broad support from across the political spectrum. Michael had also reconnected with several of Rick's other victims, finding unexpected community among people who understood what it meant to be treated as disposable entertainment. They had formed an informal support network, sharing resources, offering emotional support, and coordinating their various legal actions. Amanda had become a particular friend, her fierce advocacy inspiring Michael on days when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. "We survived," she told him during one of their regular phone calls. "We survived, and we turned our pain into something that might protect others. That is not nothing, that is everything." Physical therapy continued to improve Michael's mobility and independence. He learned to cook using techniques designed for people with low vision. He mastered public transportation routes. He got a guide dog, an intelligent German shepherd named Wellington, who quickly became his constant companion and a source of joy in difficult moments. The process of adaptation was ongoing and sometimes frustrating, but Michael approached it with the same discipline he had brought to his military service. This was simply a different kind of training, a different kind of mission. He would master it because the alternative was unacceptable. Captain Reynolds visited regularly, bringing news from the palace and from the guards who had served with Michael. The regiment had established a scholarship in Michael's name for children of serving guards. A memorial bench had been placed near the spot where he had been attacked, bearing a plaque that read, "Sergeant Michael Harrison stood his ground here. May we all stand for what is right." The king himself had sent a personal letter thanking Michael for his service and his continued dedication to protecting others through his advocacy work. These gestures meant more to Michael than he could easily express. They confirmed that his service had mattered, that he had not been forgotten, that the military community still considered him one of their own. The night before Emma's wedding, Michael sat in his quiet living room reflecting on everything that had changed in the past year. A year ago, he had been planning his retirement, looking forward to a peaceful transition into civilian life. Instead, he had been attacked, permanently disabled, thrust into a national spotlight, and forced to rebuild his entire life from the ground up. It would have been easy to be bitter, to focus on everything that had been stolen from him. But Michael had learned something through this ordeal. Purpose was not something external that could be taken away. It was something internal that you chose. His purpose had been to serve and protect. That had not changed. The uniform was gone, but the duty remained. Now he protected people by speaking truth about the cost of casual cruelty. He served by fighting for laws and cultural changes that would make others safer. He stood guard not at a palace gate, but at the boundary between acceptable behavior and harm disguised as entertainment. It was different from what he had planned, but it was no less important. Perhaps it was even more important, because the threats he now faced were insidious and normalized in ways that physical threats never were. Emma knocked softly on the door before entering. "Dad, you should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." She sat beside him, and Michael reached over to take her hand. "I have been thinking about your mother. How much I wish she could be here tomorrow. How proud she would be of the woman you have become." Emma's voice was thick with emotion. "She would be proud of you too. For everything. For surviving, for fighting, for not letting what happened to you define who you are." Michael smiled. "I think she would mostly be proud that I finally learned to use the dishwasher properly." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Michael stood in the church vestibule with Emma, her arm linked through his Wellington, sitting attentively at his other side. He could hear the murmur of guests, the soft music playing, David waiting nervously at the altar. Emma was describing herself to him since he could not see her clearly. "The dress is ivory, with lace sleeves like Mom wanted. My hair is up, I am wearing her pearls, and I am absolutely terrified and absolutely happy at the same time." Michael squeezed her arm gently. "That sounds perfect. You sound perfect. Are you ready?" The music swelled into the wedding march. Michael began walking, counting steps the way he had practiced, feeling the slight tug of Emma's arm to guide him, trusting Wellington to help him navigate. The guests stood. Cameras flashed, and Michael walked his daughter down the aisle just as he had promised, just as he had always imagined, even if he could not see the moment as clearly as he had hoped. When they reached the altar and the officiant asked who gave this woman to be married, Michael's voice was strong and clear. "Her mother and I do." He kissed Emma's cheek, shook David's hand firmly, and took his seat in the front row, his duty fulfilled. During the reception, Michael gave a toast that had everyone crying and laughing. He talked about love and resilience, about promises kept and futures unknown. He talked about his late wife and how she had taught him that strength, was not about never falling down, but about always getting back up. He talked about Emma and David and the life they were building together, and he ended with words that applied to more than just the newlyweds. Life will throw things at you that you did not expect and did not deserve. You will face challenges that seem insurmountable, but you have a choice in how you respond. You can let those challenges defeat you, or you can let them reveal who you truly are. Choose to be kind. Choose to be brave. Choose to stand up for what is right, even when it costs you. That is how you build a life worth living. 6 months later, Michael received a letter from the prison where Rick Davison was serving his sentence. It was from Rick himself, a single page of cramped handwriting. Michael had Wellington guide him to his desk where he kept his screen-reading device that could scan and read text aloud. Rick's letter was awkward and self-conscious, but it seemed more genuine than anything he had said at trial. I know this does not fix anything. I know sorry does not mean much from me, but I have had a lot of time to think about what I did and who I was. I was so focused on views and money and fame that I forgot other people were real. I treated everyone like they existed to serve my content. I know I deserve to be here. I know I hurt you, and so many others. I am trying to be better. I am working with the prison psychologist. I am taking education courses. I am learning to be a person instead of a brand. I do not expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that you were right about everything you said in court, and I am trying to change. Michael sat with the letter for a long time, processing his feelings. He did not know if Rick's change was genuine or if this was simply another performance, this time with himself as the audience. But he realized it did not matter. Whether Rick Davison became a better person or not, whether he truly understood the harm he caused or simply learned to fake remorse more convincingly, Michael's life would continue forward. He had built something meaningful from tragedy. He had turned his pain into purpose. He had stood his ground in the most important ways. He wrote a brief response, keeping it simple and honest. Your journey toward becoming a better person is your responsibility, not mine. I cannot give you forgiveness or absolution. That is not my role. What I can tell you is that real change requires action, not just words. If you are serious about being better, then be better. Help others. Speak out against the kind of content you used to create. Use whatever platform you may have in the future to prevent others from making your mistakes. That is how you make amends. Not by apologizing to me, but by ensuring no one else becomes the next victim. He sent the letter and then let it go, returning his focus to the work that mattered. Years would pass. Michael would continue his advocacy, speaking at conferences and schools, consulting on legislation, supporting other victims. Emma would have children, and Michael would be the grandfather he had feared he could never be, teaching them about duty and honor and kindness through his actions rather than his words. Rick would serve his sentence, and Michael would neither follow his progress nor forget what he had done. Wellington would grow old and eventually be replaced by another guide dog who would serve Michael with the same dedication. The world would continue changing, hopefully in small ways toward more accountability and less casual cruelty. But on this particular evening, Michael simply sat in his living room with Wellington at his feet, listening to the sounds of his neighborhood settling into night. He could not see the stars, but he knew they were there. He could not see the future clearly, but he knew he would face it with the same resolve that had defined his entire life. He had been a soldier, a guard, a father, a victim, and now an advocate. Each role had taught him something about strength and vulnerability, about standing firm and adapting to change. He was not the same man who had stood at his post that August morning. He was someone forged by fire, scarred but not broken, changed but not defeated. And in the darkness behind his damaged eyes, Michael Harrison could finally see clearly what mattered most. Not fame or views or viral moments, but dignity, justice, and the quiet courage of standing up for what was right, even when it cost everything. That was the post he would guard for the rest of his life.